Story that we are focusing on. 84 people have been killed in the city of Nice and about 50 have been injured after a man drove a truck into a crowd of people celebrating the storming of Bastille. The driver ran over he went on for 2 kilometers along the promenade at around 11 p.m. He also opened fire on people in the crowd and the police before eventually being shot dead. The attacker has been identified locally as a 31-year-old Franco-Tunisian origin from identity papers that were found inside the lorry. However, police are yet to confirm the details. The attack in Nice makes it the 10th terror incident in France since January 2015. NBC's Kelly Kobelia has brought us this report.
Well, this was supposed to be a day of celebration, an evening of celebration across France. Instead, in the coastal city of Nice, just as the fireworks ended, a truck plowed into the crowd. The moment of terror captured on a cell phone when a white truck plows into a crowd. Families celebrating the French holiday Bastille Day mowed down, hundreds running for safety, witnesses panicking.
We started hearing shrieks, and at the first moment that people started running, they were kind of zigzagging left and right, so we didn't know which way to run. I've never seen anything quite like it.
It happened on the promenade in the city of Nice on the famed French Riviera. One eyewitness said the truck hopped the curb, zigzagging at a high speed on the crowded promenade, and reports of shots fired. The mayor of Nice warning people to stay indoors, fears tonight of another terror attack.
There are great hallmarks of terrorism on this attack. People taking a truck or a small car and ramming them into individuals or crowds in order to kill them with the most improvised, device that they have at hand.
It comes 8 months after the ISIS attack on Paris. Several sites struck then. Cafes, the soccer stadium, the theater. More than 120 killed. A state of emergency was declared and is still in effect today. French officials have now confirmed the truck driver did, in fact, fire on the crowd and also had explosives and grenades in his truck. He was killed by police.
And to discuss today is that horrific incident and the spate of terror-related attacks that France has witnessed over the past 1 year and more. I'm now joined by David Lee. He's a senior Europe analyst at Control Risks in London. Thank you very much, David, for joining us here on The Big Picture. I want to ask you because, predictably, the right-wing groups in France have been after the French president, saying that, the intelligence agencies in France have not been strengthened. Otherwise, these sort of terror attacks should have been preempted. But my question is, in this case, look at this. I mean, look at the weapon that he has used. It's a truck at the end of the day. He has this one individual sitting in a truck and he runs down people. So in that sense, are sort of preempting terror attacks becoming increasingly difficult for countries the world over?
Yeah, that's exactly it. The methods that terrorists are using are designed to stay one step ahead of the police and of the other law enforcement and intelligence agencies coming after them. So where previously we saw homemade bombs, car bombs, truck bombs, rucksack bombs, and then it moved towards firearms and towards knives. And so the security operation has largely been defined against those threats. And so some of the Islamist propaganda out there says use what you can. And a car and a truck is a very easily accessible and very effective weapon. And that's what we saw last night in Nice.
So what happens then in such an environment? How do countries protect themselves? So clearly the old tools that were being used by intelligence agencies of trying to, overhear conversations, listen into conversations between terrorists appears at this stage to be largely ineffective.
It was ineffective in this case, largely because there's no evidence emerged nearly 24 hours after the attack. There's no evidence emerged that the guy responsible for this was working with anybody else, was even a follower of any Islamist extremist ideology. So all the intelligence and all the surveillance that the authorities have introduced in the last couple of years, France has really tried to increase the strength of its intelligence force but only really began doing so a couple of years ago. And it takes time to train intelligence officers. But with the attack method this guy chose, and seemingly with relatively few links or with very complicated links to look at and investigate, it's a very difficult job for intelligence to turn anything up.
But we're actually still waiting for those links to be established, and that really is my question, because here's this individual that you also said with no past sort of association with any Islamist terrorist organization, yet the world is so sure that he is a terrorist. I mean, how sure are you, David? I mean, and because just because he happens to be a Muslim, are we now sort of pre-guessing that this is indeed a terror strike? Because so far ISIS or no organization has claimed credit for it, and we know how quick they are to claim credit, even if they don't play a part in these kind of attacks.
Yeah, I think the links that the guy might have to Islamic State or to any other Islamist extremist organization are as yet very hazy indeed, and it may well turn out that he's not connected to them at all. He could, of course, just be inspired by them and have no formal links or no history of talking to them, or it could well be that he is just acting on a different basis. He's acting in a similar way to some of the people who engage in mass shootings, for example, or other types of crime, and it's a mental illness issue, perhaps. So all that at the moment is unclear. So I think we can be very quick to jump to conclusions on this, and I think until motive is really established, then I think we're probably as well limiting. But what I would say is that whatever he's done, he's driven a truck through a crowd of people. And if that's not a terrorist attack, whatever the motivation is, then I don't know what is.
Absolutely, David. You're right. But questions are also being asked now, and I think they're really pertinent questions to also ask, that why is it France over and over again? Because my producer tells me that since January 2015, there have actually been 10 different kinds of terror attacks. Of course, not not all of them, thankfully, have been as gruesome as the ones in Paris. Or the one we witnessed today here in Nice. But there have at least been 10 attacks in France over the last year and a half. Why has France become such a soft target?
I think there's a combination of factors. Islamic State explicitly said 2 years ago, a senior Islamic State cleric, or Islamic State friendly cleric, explicitly stated that France was a significant nation to target. Now, France has also had by far the most nationals of any European nation operating in Syria with the jihadist groups there. And France is a symbol of the secular, Western, democratic, liberal society, with all the plus points and minus points that has, depending on your points of view. And I think a combination of all these factors is going to place France at a greater degree of vulnerability. And another factor on top of that is the fact that a number of these attacks have worked. We've seen a number of these attacks causing significant damage, significant loss of life, and that just in itself is going to inspire people to attack again. So there are a huge number of factors here, not even accounting for the alienation and the marginalization of France's large Muslim community, who haven't enjoyed some of the benefits of economic advancements in the last few decades, maybe. There's so many factors at play here. There's no country with that total combination of factors that France has, and that is probably why it's being attacked at the moment. We can't really single any one thing out.
Yeah, absolutely. David, I don't want to sound too hyperbolic here, but then, if this attack also, happens to be, sort of carried out by a terrorist, we still do not know for sure, as you've also highlighted. But if this is also a terrorist strike, then of course, this, sort of adds to the litany of terrorist strikes that we've seen in this year alone. Would you say then that we are actually seeing, this is actually a class of civilization that we are seeing, where the Islamist terrorists are actually attacking the core civilizational values of a place like Europe? I mean, is that a fair assumption to make at this stage?
That's definitely the image they want to portray, and I think that's the reaction they're looking for from Europe's political leaders. I think probably an alternative approach from Europe would be to treat this as a systemic but still, relatively infrequent problem, although, we're seeing it happen more and more frequently. But I think the idea that it's a clash of civilizations is exactly the sort of divisive narrative that these them against us extremist groups are seeking to put forward. So I think the policy response of Europe so far has been to emphasize what everybody walking around in Europe has in common. And I think that's, in the long term, is going to be an effective message, but it does leave leaders vulnerable to politicians who take that opposite view, who take that view that it's a clash of ultimately incompatible goals. And that's a common theme among the far right, particularly the National Front in France, who have been doing very well in opinion polls and in local and regional elections lately.
Then, David, if this is indeed, sort of an attack on the Western way of life, do you feel somewhere that, at the beginning, many of the leading Western politicians have also been, sort of dismissive of the ISIS? Because, remember Obama's statement saying that ISIS does not pose an existential threat to the United States. You think now with this, with this kind of, with these range of attacks where ISIS is clearly spreading its tentacles around the world, there has to be a sort of, the policymakers, the politicians need to take these terror organizations with a lot more seriousness, precisely why they're attacking the very foundational basis of Western civilization as we know it.
I think Obama's statement about ISIS not posing an existential threat to the US was actually quite nuanced and quite carefully worded. And I think he said that it doesn't threaten the existence of the US full stop. What it does do is it affects the daily manifestation of that for a number of people in the US. So it could regularly cause attacks, but the basic principles of the US, the freedom of which United States politicians are always so keen to talk about, that's going to continue. That's going to persist whatever ISIS does. And I think Europe's got to perhaps pick up some of that confidence that President Obama had in that speech and reassert its own values and its own confidence in its position so far, rather than succumbing to this, to a rather divisive them against us narrative, which is what the people who are doing this want.
That's an excellent point you've made there, David, and we're going to leave this conversation here. We're going to